Well, good evening, everyone. You can hear me, yeah? Sound working. Great. We're going to be looking at the topic of Jesus, myth, legend, or history. It's amazing, actually, this phenomenon that's happening in Britain and to some extent in Sweden, where there are people, and they're intelligent people, who don't believe Jesus ever existed. And for me, this is really amazing cultural phenomenon that this could happen when there's so much evidence that he did. Now, what I want to do, I want to take us on some of the Christian sources about Jesus. But first, I thought it'd be good to look at some non-Christian early documents about how Christianity began, because they basically attest the existence of Jesus Christ. One of them is a writer called Tacitus. Now, Tacitus grew up probably in Rome, and he was a high-up Roman, and he wrote some great histories, quite sort of Guardian style, if you like. And he actually is the first person to report in classical writing about the lochs in Scotland. So he's able to write about things that happen at great distance. And he writes about the fire that took place in Rome in the year 64, and people thought the mad Emperor Nero had started that. Yes, world leaders has often been eccentric and more. But anyway, here he break into his narrative where he talks about Christus, that's Latin for Christ, the founder of the name of Christian, had undergone the death penalty in the reign of Tiberius. Now, Tiberius was emperor from the year 14 through to the year 37. So just from this guy, without reading any Christian sources, we know when Christ got put to death. And it happened by the sentence of the procurator Pontius Pilatus. Well, Pontius Pilate, he's a guy mentioned a lot in the Bible. And actually we know when he was in charge of Judea was from the year 26 to the year 36. So again, we can narrow down to within 10 years when Jesus was put to death. And the pernicious superstition was checked for a moment, only to break out once more, not merely in Judea, the home of the disease, but in the capital, and that's Rome, where all things horrible or shameful in the world collect and become fashionable. So in this time, Christianity has moved from Judea across to Rome. Now, give you a sense of geography on that. Rome, distance from Rome to Judea, and the New Testament talks about Jesus being crucified at Jerusalem. That's the same distance as from Rome to the top of the Shetland Islands. Yeah, you know, the ones above the Orkneys. Okay, so it's quite a good distance. And Christianity here, we're in the year 64, seems to have spread far and fast. So within, three and a half decades, it's gone all of that distance. He then talks about what happened to these people who were Christians. First, then, the confessed members of the sect were arrested. Next, on their disclosures, vast numbers were convicted, not so much on the count of arson as for a hatred of the human race. Yes, hate crimes, even back then. And derision accompanied their end. They were covered with wild beast skins and torn to death by dogs, or they were fastened on crosses, and when daylight failed, were burned to serve as lamps by night. So there we have a Roman author who really doesn't like Christians, but he writes about what happened. Here's another one who also doesn't like Christians. Pliny is Pliny the Younger, not to be confused with Pliny the Elder, who was his uncle, who was a great scientist. He was such a great scientist that when Vesuvius erupted in the year 79, he wanted to get as close as he could. That was like a bit fatal for him. Anyway, so here we have the younger Pliny writing around the year 110 to the emperor. Now, when you write to the emperor, you write creepy letters. You write this creepy letter, "Oh, emperor, you're so wise. You know everything about how to deal with things. So I just want to check that I'm doing the right procedure with these awkward Christians." And so he's governor of northwest Turkey, places called Bithynia and Pontus. And this is what he says. "I interrogated these people as to whether they were Christians. If they confessed it, I interrogated them a second and a third time, threatening punishment. If they persisted, I ordered them to be led off." That means led off to execution. "As for those who denied that they were or ever had been Christians, when they invoked the gods in words given by me and prayed with incense and wine offerings to your statue, which I had ordered to be brought for this very purpose, along with the images of the gods, and also cursed Christ, which it said that no true Christian could ever be compelled to do, I thought they should be discharged." Well, that is just really nice, isn't it? So what you've got to realize, he's a moderate governor. So a sort of extreme governor would bump off everyone who's ever been called Christian, and a lenient one would just let them all off. And he's sort of got this middle line, which is you bump off everyone who persists as a Christian, but you let off those who renounce Christianity. Okay, you get the idea. And so he's wanting to check with the emperor that he's doing the right thing. So that's what's going on here. Now, What we notice, though, he's got these tests for whether people are Christians. Have you noticed them? Are they prepared to worship the Roman gods? How on earth can that work? Because why couldn't you worship the Roman gods and worship Christ? Now, notice here, we got the word Christ. And just from the word Christ and Christian, we know a certain amount, because Christ is the Greek equivalent, Christos, of the Hebrew word Messiah. And Messiah is the word that's used for the promised Jewish deliverer. So if you've got a group of people called after Christian, then obviously you know that they have been, they believe that the promised Jewish deliverer has come. The other thing we notice is that they get called Christians by others. It's not that they call themselves Christians. Now, big Quaker area, isn't it, here? Quaker is an interesting word because at first it wasn't applied by the Friends to themselves, it applied by outsiders, and then only later do they adopt it as their own terminology. Same with the word Methodist. At first it's used as an outsider term, then the Methodists take it up. So it's exactly the same with the word Christian. Now, what we see here is that these people who are being tested for whether they're being Christian, there's a logic to the test, and the logic is, are they prepared to worship the Roman gods? Now, how on earth does that work? Well, it works only if you remember that Christianity began in the cradle of Judaism. The whole word Christianity, Christos, all that has to come from Judaism. Okay, mathematical question for tonight. Well, there are not going to be many, but I've got one of them. How many gods do Jews believe in? One. That's good. Yes, very good. Okay, now, second mathematical question. This is more difficult. How many gods do Romans believe in? Lots. Yes, thank you. That's very good. And Greeks? Lots. Good. And anyone seen Percy Jackson? Okay. So you know what happens? One of the gods gets down, sees a damsel or whatever, gets together, and they produce another half. And that's the numbers can just go up all the time. So with Judaism, only ever one God, and with Greek and Roman religion, you can have lots of numbers, just like they procreate. Okay, so it goes up. Right. And here we got the test that clearly shows that the Christians are keeping up the same belief of the Jews. They're not prepared to just worship the Roman gods. Now, this is really interesting because then it talks about a document denouncing some people as Christians. Others named in the document said that they were Christians, but later denied it, saying they had been, but they'd ceased 3 years ago or many years ago, or even as much as 20. And then he goes on to describe what these people who gave up on Christianity 20 years before the year 110, you can do that in your heads, actually described as a Christian meeting. They said that this had been the full extent of their guilt or error. They'd been accustomed to meet on a fixed day before dawn and to sing antiphonally, that's one group to another, a song to Christ as to a God, and to bind themselves by an oath not to some crime, but rather not to commit theft, robbery, or adultery, not to break their trust, and not to refuse to return a pledge when asked to do so. Now, why do they meet before dawn? Because slaves can't get time off to go to church, but they meet on this fixed day, and they sing to Christ as to a God. Now, this is written in Latin. Has anyone here done Latin? Yeah, I'm not going to ask you Latin questions, don't worry, it's okay, a few more hands maybe. Can anyone, though, tell me the Latin word for a? Like a, There isn't one. Brilliant, thank you. So that's why when this translation says as to a God, you don't know whether it's as to God or as to the God or as to a God, because it's all the same in Latin, quasi deo. Right. Now, the test, however, works on the basis that they don't worship the Roman gods, but hang on, they're singing to Christ and treating him as God. That's really interesting. And this is happening like 80 or so years after Christianity began. Now, a lot of people have this idea that at first people thought Jesus was a very special human, then a very, very special human, then a very, very, very special human, and then after enough time, halfway to God, 3/4 of the way, and all the way after a while, God himself. And that's the way it works, just the way urban myths grow up, that's the way it grows. There's a mathematical problem with that. Can you see it? In Judaism, you can never have 1.5 gods, right? So there isn't actually a path of sort of slowly creeping up the number of gods and then leaping over. It just doesn't work. Or if you like, within Judaism, they believe there's the creator who made everything, and there's the created on the other side. And you can't sneak across from one side to the other. It just doesn't work. So this is really interesting, that these people are suffering because they're not prepared to worship the Roman gods, and yet they're treating Christ as God. And for me, the only way this works mathematically is if somehow they have come to understand this human as the Jewish creator God who made the universe, which is really a very startling thing to be happening this soon after, he was around. Now, he then talks about how many people have become Christians. Many people of every age and every rank and of both sexes are being and will be called to trial. Nor is it only the cities that are affected, but the disease of this superstition is also reaching villages and farmsteads. It seems possible to check and correct this. It's pretty well agreed that the temples, which had almost become deserted, have now begun to be frequented again. And all the sacred rites which have been neglected for a long time are recommencing, and the flesh for sacrificial rites is being sold, for which up to now it's hard to find a purchaser. So here we've got the governor of northwest Turkey writing to the emperor, saying that so many people in his area have become Christians that it's actually affecting the trade for sacrificial meat for the temples in a big way. So it's really interesting because the further and the faster Christianity spreads, you can see it's actually the harder it is to be changing the message in substantial ways after it's got going. It's like trying to, change a PR campaign halfway through. It's not going to work. Things are, the cat's out of the bag and it's been released. How can you logistically start changing the message? I mean, imagine if you had one version of Christianity being launched over here, another one in this other country. Just all the traveling you'd have to do to get people on the same page would be such a lot of work. So that's just a brief tour of a couple of non-Christian sources. I want to look mainly at Christian sources. Now, of course, people say, well, why can't I see it all from non-Christian sources? It's like this. Most people who write about golf are golf enthusiasts. Most people who write about football are football enthusiasts. Most people who write about Jesus are Jesus enthusiasts. It's just like that's the way life is. But what's really interesting is when we think about who was the most famous dude at the time of Jesus, it's of course the Roman Emperor Tiberius. Now, how many books does he have written about himself? Well, I've given you 4 authors. He had 4 authors writing about him, and Jesus has Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. So there are 4 biographies of each. Then you look at the number of words there are in each. And these 4 Gospels have got quite a lot of words. Those are the ones in an edition I was involved in. This Tacitus wrote quite a few more words, but that's in his annals. They're really telling the years of Tiberius' reign. It's not all about Tiberius. So actually, there's arguably less about the Roman emperor than there is about Jesus. And that's really startling, because how can it be that a Jew from a small village in Palestine has more written about them than the Roman emperor? Then we look at when's our earliest manuscript of them, and you can see that 16th century, 9th century, and so on. And when they're written, well, we're not sure about all of these, but we can say there's one of them was written while Tiberius was alive, okay, and the other one was written 70 years after he died, another one 80 years, another one 130. How do the Gospels do? Well, these dates are not my dates. These are dates of some skeptical scholars. These are dates by an agnostic called Bart Ehrman, who writes various skeptical things about the Bible. I thought I'd put them in because at least I'm going to have dates that are close to the time than that. So what you can see is that the records you got about Jesus do really well compared with what you got about the emperor, except for you say, well, isn't there that guy, Velleius Paterculus is how you say it, who wrote during the emperor's lifetime? Yeah. But he's the one person people trust the least because he's in the emperor's pay and only ever says nice things about it. So when you read Velleius Paterculus, you think that, Tiberius is a saint. When you read Tacitus and the rest, you realise he killed all his enemies and most of his friends. And so he was really not at all a nice guy. Now, it's not just that in the New Testament you've got these 4 Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. They're the first books you come to, and they take about half the space. You also have other books, like 27 books in total in the New Testament, and each one of them presupposes that Jesus is a living being in some sense. Now, not every single one of them says he's a physical living being explicitly, but some of them very clearly do. So the very first verse of this letter written by the Apostle Paul, written about the year 50, so within 20 years, say, of Jesus dying, talks about the resurrection as sort of core belief that they had believed all along. 1 Corinthians, another letter written within 30 years of the events, talks about 500 people having seen Jesus risen from the dead. But let's go and test out the Gospels and see how reliable they are. Well, I was talking to a geographer earlier, maybe more than one geographer. So we're going to do a bit of geography tonight. Sorry, the print's too small. You don't need to worry about reading it because it's just town and village names. So what I thought I'd do is I get the 4 Gospels, and those are columns 2 to 4 twice over there, Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, and I put a tick every time that a particular town or village is mentioned. Now I want you to think about, let's say you need to write a story about life in a country you've never visited, and you're going to mention lots of towns and villages. How well are you going to do? Well, we've got all sorts of access to information nowadays. We've got the internet, and so we can do that sort of thing. But if you didn't, how on earth would you be able to do it? Because these gospel writers just show that they simply know the names of towns, they know the names of regions, they know the names of even individual rivers and bodies of water and pools. You can look at, they even know the names of gardens, all sorts of things like that. In fact, I find a really interesting thing. There are just so many place names mentioned in the 4 Gospels. They really do know their way round Palestine. And I found an interesting thing that if you look at the place names and you divide them by the number of words they have, you find this bottom line here. This is the geeky thing for tonight. I like numbers. Which is that basically they have about 5 place names per 1,000 words, all 4 of them, even though 4 of them have completely different Greek style and are written by different people. Well, how do you get a number like that? The answer is by not trying. If you try to put in place names to make your story sound authentic, one's going to put in too many, one's going to put in too few, and it won't work. But this is what might happen if you're not trying and you're simply reporting truthfully what happens when. Now, it's not just that they know the names of towns, they also know where to go up and down. For instance, in the Gospels, in different Gospels, it will say that you go up to Jerusalem, which is plus 750 meters, and you go down from Jerusalem. Jesus is said to have told this story about the parable of the Good Samaritan. You know the Samaritans, hopefully you don't have to phone them, but if you do what they tell. Jesus tells this story about a man went down from Jerusalem to Jericho. Well, Jericho's the lowest city on earth, minus 250 meters. Jerusalem's at plus 750. You have to go down a kilometre. Don't know what that is in miles. Less than a mile. 5/8 of a mile, isn't it? But I can't do that, the proper conversion anyway. You clearly have to go down, and Jesus gets that right. And then you have other Gospels that will talk about, say, Jesus going down from Cana, which is high up, to Capernaum, or from Nazareth, which is high up, to Capernaum. Every time they talk about going up and down, they get it right. Every time they get the travelling times, they get it right. There's a man reported in the Gospels who says, come down. Now, what does this prove? Does it prove the story is true? No, of course it doesn't. But what it does do is it shows that the writers either have been close enough geographically to the events to get things right, or they've taken really careful note when they've been told the stories. Those are your 2 options. They're either from the land or they've taken really careful note as they're told about it. Here's just a phrase or a few sentences attributed to Jesus. There are places he's said to have done particular miracles, and he says, woe to them. Woe to you, Chorazin, which is a little village. Woe to you, Bethsaida, slightly bigger place. For if the mighty works, which means miracles done in you, have been done in Tyre and Sidon, which are a couple of sort of non-Jewish big towns, they would have repented long ago, sitting in sackcloth and ashes, but it will be more bearable in the judgment for Tyre and Sidon than for you. And you, Capernaum, will you be exalted to heaven? You'll be brought down to Hades. So we've got 3 Jewish places, and you look at them on Google Maps, and there they are. This is the Sea of Galilee, and we're talking about just a few miles around here. So what we have in that snippet is clearly whoever wrote that was either close to the place or they reported accurately things that have been handed down. And remember that getting the names of towns you've never visited right is actually quite hard, to get them all right. So I looked at it and I thought, well, is there any way that the gospel writers can get their geography out of books? Could they like go into a bookshop in Rome and buy a book on geography and it would tell you? But the answer is no, because a bookshop in Rome might give you a book about geography, but it'd be all the places you needed to visit before you die, maybe the pyramids in Giza, but it's not going to have the little villages of Palestine. So I looked at every single one, Strabo, Pliny, Tacitus, and so on. Not a single one of them can give me every single town I need, always writing at the right time. I mean, Ptolemy, he's the great astronomer. He's a little bit too late. He doesn't have all the town names. So that's just one test. Let's do another test. This is the test of what people are called. So in the Gospels, you've got lots of characters. Now, you notice that if you, say, go off to Russia, you might find lots of people called Dmitri and Vladimir and so on, yeah? But around here, you can get that, and there may be some even in the room tonight, but they're probably going to be fewer, right, than you'd have. And if you go from different country to country, they have different most popular names. So we're going to look and see, do the characters in the Gospels have the right names? Now, sometimes we might read the lists of, like, what's the most popular baby name, and be quite surprised. You think, really, is that the most popular baby name? I had no idea that was so popular. In fact, when I gave my son the name Leo, I thought that was really rare, and no one else. And then there's 3 in his class, And so my intuition as to what was a popular name and what wasn't was wrong. So imagine here, you have to write a story, make up a story about a place you've never visited. Can you get the names right? I don't think you're going to get them in the right proportion. In fact, even if you are making up a story about where you live, you probably can't get the names in the right proportions. But what we find is this. In the New Testament, in the Gospels and the book of Acts, which is written by the guy who also wrote the third Gospel, Luke Acts, when they talk about Jewish men from Palestine, the most popular name for men is Simon. It's also the most popular outside the New Testament. If you look at the second most popular name, it's Joseph. That's also the second most popular outside the New Testament. And there are sources like the Dead Sea Scrolls, there are bone boxes where Granny's bones are in here, and you write Granny's name or whatever. That's what they do. And so what you find is you can build up statistics. People have been building this up the last 30 years, and you find they're getting the right proportion of names. In fact, you have it so that the 2 most popular names inside the New Testament are about 18% of the names, and outside 15 to 16%. You get the top 9 men's names, so you've got a bigger data sample, suddenly things start getting really quite close. 40% inside the New Testament and 41 outside. Now with ladies' names, you don't have as many. Data sample's a bit smaller, but it goes but similar. Mary is the most popular name for a Palestinian Jewish woman. That's the most common name in the New Testament and most common outside. It fits. Whereas there are loads of Jews in other places. So there are Jewish names. You can look at the catacombs in Rome. You can go to Turkey. You can go to Egypt. You can get different Jewish names. Here's some Jewish names from Egypt. And what you find is there are different names. Does anyone know anyone called Sabbatai? Dositheus? Pappus? No, why don't you know anyone with those names? Because the Gospels weren't written about Jewish men in Egypt. If there had been, those would be quite common names. So actually we find this works. Now, you've got a further thing. You see, if Simon is a really common name, then you have to do what Wikipedia talks about, disambiguation. Yeah? So how are you going to distinguish one Simon from another Simon? So this is what happens. Jesus has a couple of disciples called Simon. One is Simon Peter, so he gets an extra bit, or Cephas. The other is Simon the Zealot, or sometimes called Simon the Canaanite. Mary Magdalene, she came from Magdala. Or Mary, the mother of James and Joseph. You can do Joseph of Arimathea. You get with all the most popular names, you add an extra bit, and you don't do it with the other names. So this is a really striking feature. Now, one of the things we see, when we watch films, we remember the stories generally of the films far better than we remember the characters or the actors. I mean, some of us, can do actor names better than others. My kids can do them reasonably well. But actually it's hard. Why is it so hard to remember people's names? There may be even someone in this room, whose name you've forgotten. In fact, you can remember the last conversation you had with them. You can remember what car they drive or what job they do. And you can remember members of their family. You just can't remember that thing. Why? Because names are basically logically arbitrary. They're random labels stuck on. How are you supposed to stick that into your memory? There's nothing to stick it. Stories are threads, So, if the Gospels are getting right the detail that's the hardest thing to remember, namely names, there's every reason to think they can get the story stuff right. And so I think this is a very good evidence that what we're getting is not stories as they've been repeated by several generations. Because actually, we know that one of the first things to get corrupted and dropped off when stories get retold are the names. What we see is across the Gospels, we're getting things early in the process of being told. Now, I want to give you a list of Jesus' disciples as told in Matthew's Gospel in the 10th chapter. And I put in brackets whenever those names, where their rank is in the top 99 names or whatever. So Simon, ranked number 1, therefore gets a disambiguator called Peter. And Andrew, that's low ranking, so not even in the top 99, but he's explained as the brother of Simon. So in other words, he's clear. James, 11th, high ranking, therefore give dad's name, the son of Zebedee. And John, high ranking, his brother. Philip, low ranking, 61st equal, don't need to say anything more. And Bartholomew, 50th equal, don't need to say anything more. And Thomas, not even on the charts, don't need to say anything more. But Matthew, high ranking, number 9, therefore the tax collector. James, high ranking, the son of Alphaeus. Thaddeus, low ranking, so let's call him, so we don't need anything extra. Simon, the Cananean, Judas Iscariot. You see, there's a correlation between whether I have a surname, if you like, and statistics that have only been known about the names for the last 20 or 30 years. In other words, what this is showing us is this list has been formed in the land itself. Otherwise, you wouldn't be able to explain it. This even works in conversations. There's a time when Herod beheads John the Baptist, okay? And this is what he hears about Jesus having already beheaded John, and he thinks this is John the Baptist come back. It says, this is John the Baptist. He couldn't just say to his servants, this is John, because John was the 5th most common name for Palestinian Jewish males. So they would have said, which John? You've got several working in the palace. In fact, you've got lots of palaces and they've got lots of Johns working in them. But what you see is the next verse, the narrator says he sees John. So what we see is the character in the narrative speaks one way, and the narrator speaks another way. The character in the narrative speaks the way you would have to have spoken back then in order to be clear, right? And then, narrator again, but then there's this woman who wants John the Baptist's head, and so she can't just say, give me the head of John. She might have got the head of the wrong John, so she says, give me the head of John the Baptist, and then we see straight afterwards, so he sent a beheaded John. So the narrator speaks one way, the characters in the narrative speak another way. Now, this is a horrible analogy, but it's a bit like the name Adolf. If you said Adolf in 1900, it was quite a common German name. And it doesn't conjure up any particular individual. When you say it, in 1950, it conjures up a particular individual. Exactly the same thing happens with the rather nicer name Jesus, okay? Where you find early on, Jesus was like a really common name. It's the 6th most common name. So you can't just say Jesus is coming down the street, because they would say, which Jesus you're talking about. Whenever the Gospels talk about Jesus in speech marks, in a crowd setting, then you have a disambiguator every single time. Because they're actually reporting the way people would have spoken. But when you're outside that, they don't have to do it. So, in other words, we're getting early reporting. Now, it's not just that they know about names, they also know about taxes. In Matthew and Mark, there's a story about Jesus having dinner with lots and lots of these toll collectors in the place of Capernaum. Now, Capernaum's not just any old place. It's at the top of the Sea of Galilee, which is the first town you come to when you come over a land border from the east for you, land border from the east. As you come over, or if you come across the Sea of Galilee, that's where you're going to pay your toll. And that's only in Matthew and Mark. It's not in the other Gospels. But then, Luke's Gospel has got a different story about a tax collector, this time a chief tax collector. So obviously there must be lots of other tax collectors in his area. Short guy called Zacchaeus. And he's in Jericho, which is much further south. But again, what's in common It's the first town you come to when you come across the River Jordan and you're changing political jurisdiction. In other words, they have toll collectors exactly where you need to collect toll. So these are the sorts of details you're getting in the Gospels that are right. Now, there are tiny details which you can find really just fit in the Gospels where you get independent reporting. I want to give you an example of it. In the first three Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, Jesus is in the Garden of Gethsemane shortly before he's due to die. And he's praying to God, to his Father, God, if it's your will, can we not go through with this? Or please can this, and his expression is, can this cup pass from me? Now that cup is a particular expression, I think cup of suffering, but also it's a deeper expression from Jewish symbolism where it's talking about the cup of judgment. So he says, let this cup pass from me. But isn't that a bit of a weird phrase for us? Then over in John's Gospel, you don't have any report of that prayer at all. But in that garden, when people come to arrest Jesus, Peter tries to stop them arresting him. And Jesus says this, shall I not drink the cup that the Father has given me? Now that is a really bizarre phrase for someone to come out when they're about to be grabbed. Okay, shan't I drink the cup? But of course, if he's been praying about cup, like in the other Gospels, then it makes sense that he might use that phrase. So in other words, what we find is what you often get with true reporting. You know, you split up the witnesses. Do they independently report things that dovetail? And the answer is yes. I want to look at the subject of whether what's happened to us in the reports about Jesus has been reliably handed down to us. And Birmingham is a great place to do that. I'll explain why in a minute. Now here we've got a bit of Greek. Sorry, you can see the big letter E, and that's fine. And then the letter N, and that means in, N. And this is the beginning from John's Gospel, where it says, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. And this is in a printed text, the first ever complete printed Greek New Testament brought out 500 years ago by a guy called Erasmus, who was a brainiac. He was thought to be the last guy in Europe to have read every book in Europe. I mean, like, whether he was a great publicist as well. Anyway, he was the first guy to come out with this Greek New Testament. And that was 500 years ago. And his earliest manuscripts were from the 12th century. So in other words, the gap between that and Christianity beginning, like over 1,000 years. Think of all the things that could have happened to manuscripts in those times and all the things that could have attacked them and made them change. Well, the interesting thing is that since then, of course, many manuscripts from well earlier have been found. Here's one from the 3rd century. You can zoom in, you can see the same letters to begin with. Here's another one about the same time, maybe the year 200. And again, you can see the same letters. In fact, here's my beautiful daughter. And she's outside the window of the oldest English-speaking bookshop. Is it the oldest bookshop in the English-speaking world? It's some sort of superlative thing, then it's my local bookshop. And in that window are this edition that I helped produce with Cambridge University Press, which is the Greek New Testament. So what was really nice about that is when we did the numbers, and we looked at the first 14 verses of John's Gospel, we realised that we have exactly the same sequence of 188 words as Erasmus had, and in fact exactly the same letters, 812 letters in a row, even though our manuscripts are 900 years older than he's got. And what's really interesting is if you look at all the different editions that have been made over time, so this is his one 500 years ago, and the number one place for manuscripts in the world of the New Testament is in Münster in Germany, and their edition is the same 812 letters. Then this guy, American, did it using the sort of majority voting of manuscripts, and he got the same letters. And then this secular organisation in America did, and they got the same letters. And then we did ours, and we're only the third best place in the world for the text of the New Testament, or third biggest cluster. So Münster's number one, and Tinnerhouse in Cambridge is number 3. Number 2 is Birmingham. And Birmingham producing their own edition. I'll be really interested, but I think they'll probably come up with the same edition, the same sequence of letters, because there's huge stability in what's been handed down over time. Now, I've been asked to talk about the resurrection. This bizarre belief for many people that Jesus, after getting crucified, And clearly, you can just see from the non-Christian sources, he gets put to death. It's in Tacitus. After being crucified, came back to life. Now, I want to make a threefold argument for this. So the number one argument is that lots of different people seem to have claimed to have seen Jesus risen from the dead. And when you look in the Gospels and the letters, which there are in the New Testament, you get told of people meeting with Jesus, and this is not sighting at a distance, this is meeting with, often eating with, and you find that they're meeting in different places, so Galilee in the north, Judea in the south, daytime, morning, evening, on a hill, by a lake, indoors, outdoors, by a prior appointment, without prior appointment, groups of men, groups of women, and so on. All sorts of different meetings. It's not just one phenomenon, and because these are written up in different books, clearly lots and lots of people were claiming that. Even as many as 500 people, Paul said, had seen Jesus risen from the dead. And I think it's quite a hard thing to bluff when you're only talking 25 years after the event. How can you explain it? Well, is it sincere delusion? Well, that wouldn't explain why there's an empty tomb. And also, let's remember, group hallucination doesn't exist. I mean, I hope you're not doing hallucinogenic drugs together. But if a group of you were, for the sake of the hypothesis, okay, you wouldn't all be seeing the same visions. Just wouldn't happen, So that doesn't work. And actually, if you did think you were seeing Jesus risen after he had died, you'd probably think there was an angel look-alike within Judaism. You wouldn't be thinking it's him coming back. So I think there's a strong argument you can make that I could explain away the empty tomb, because you could have some people nick a body. Why they'd nick a body, no idea, but let's say they nick a body. Some people want to hide a body. You do that, that won't explain why a whole load of people are prepared to say they believe Jesus risen from the dead, and it's clearly not for their social advantage in early Christianity. They should do so. They're not going to get anything out of it in the short term. But there's a third leg of the stool, which I think comes even better. You see, if you were to have the empty tomb and loads of people seeing Jesus risen from the dead, that'd be hard to explain. It'd be amazing who done it. But it didn't just happen to a random person, right? It happened to someone about whom all sorts of other remarkable things can also be said. Now, we know there are sometimes people who succeed in more than one career. Someone succeeds in sport and then in politics or something like this. They get famous in one area and then they move across to another. That can happen. But actually, we find with Jesus, there are just more things than ought to be the case for anyone normal. I mean, look, firstly, the very fact that he's called Jesus Christ, the very charge he was probably crucified for as the Romans. Why would they crucify someone? Because they thought people believed him to be king. In other words, you can make a good case, and many secular historians make this case, that Jesus was believed to be Messiah, the promised Jewish deliverer, before he was killed. Now, that's a remarkable thing, because that's doesn't just happen to anyone. And by the way, the Jews are just an amazing people group who've had this continuous existence and identity over thousands of years, contributed a huge amount of literature, contribute a huge amount to society, philanthropy, all sorts of things like that. So it's from that particular people group that someone believed to be the promised deliverer of this people group has actually been killed, and, people believe that they'd seen him risen from the dead. He was already believed to have performed miracles. No one in the early centuries denies that Jesus performed miracles. Skeptics in the second century claim he did it through dark magic. Okay, they don't claim that he didn't perform them. What's more, he is believed to have been descended from a king. So, it's not just everyone has that. King David, the most famous Jewish king, and to have been born in Bethlehem. Now, those were early Christian beliefs that they're clearly there already in the first century. So somehow, has he managed to convince people he's got this great genealogy, or did he actually have it? Well, actually, Jews are pretty concerned about genealogy. People kept records about that sort of thing. And Bethlehem's not just a random place. It's actually a place where there's a bit already in the first part of the Bible, written before Jesus, where it's talking about a future ruler being born. So you've got a nice convenient prophecy to fit in as well. And then we know that Jesus told some amazingly popular stories. Already talked about the parable of the Good Samaritan. Another one would be the parable of the prodigal son. You can go and read these up in Bibles or on the web. They're amazing stories.
So how can you have the same person who is believed to be the Jewish deliverer is also the person who told these amazing stories? He's also credited with remarkable teaching. Now, we've got some people here who might speak Chinese. I don't, but I put it in because it's pretty. Where this is what is called the golden rule. So Jesus is the first person to have said, whatever you wish that others would do for you, do also to them, for this is the law and the prophets. Now, Confucius, a few hundred years before him, did come out with a rule that says something like this: whatever you do not want others, yourself, do not force onto others, or whatever you do not want yourself, do not force others to do. That's what's called the negative golden rule. The first person credited with the positive golden rule is Jesus. And you say, well, how do I know Jesus said it? Let's say we don't. You've basically got two possibilities. Either Jesus said it, or he had incredibly brilliant disciples who came up with the idea and then credited him with it. Either way, it's another coincidence for him, you know? So in other words, you've got these incredible things that cluster around Jesus. Now, in the New Testament, but not just in the New Testament, also in Jewish sources, he dies at Passover time. Remember Passover and Easter sort of go around the same time, Pâques in French? It's Passover time. In other words, when the Jews are celebrating their greatest festival, their greatest deliverance, and that's when Jesus happens to die, and the message that Christians are going to take from that is that he died delivering his people. Oh, by the way, even his name, Jesus, which is about something like God saves, is a pretty convenient thing to have as your name. But I want to show you another coincidence of a sort of different kind. You see, if Jesus died between the year 26 and 36, because he happens when Pontius Pilate was governor, and he dies on a Friday, well, there's only so many days when you have a Friday, which is Passover time. And so this wonderful paper from the journal Nature on dating the crucifixion said you basically got two options. You've either go for Friday, April the 7th, AD 30, or Friday, April the 3rd, AD 33. And for various reasons, the AD 33 date works a lot better in terms of the fitting with what the Gospels say. And this is an amazing thing, because that very night was a lunar eclipse visible from Jerusalem as people are sitting down having their Passover meal. And then there's this prophecy, in the Old Testament about how moon gets turned blood red, at the time of these sort of things. So all these sort of things just are like, how many freaky coincidences you get with Jesus? Quite a lot. Now, the atheist Carl Sagan said extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. So his argument against the resurrection is, it's just, I need extraordinary evidence to believe in a miracle. Sounds reasonable, doesn't it? Except for the fact that the word extraordinary isn't defined. What is extraordinary? I find many atheist beliefs extraordinary. For instance, many of them believe that non-life gave rise to life. Never observed. So I find that extraordinary. Some people believe that non-conscious things can sort of emerge into conscious things. Again, not observed. So it seems to me that the idea that consciousness could just arise through chance processes, that's an extraordinary claim. And yet no one sees the need to defend that with an extraordinary high level of evidence. They just need to be able to tell a story whereby it might be able to happen. So in fact, we've got a problem there. But people sometimes say, well, look, if I believed in miracles, it would spoil the patterns. Beautiful science. If I'm performing my experiment and pixies and elves and everything else can get into the test tube and mess things up, how can I trust anything? So if Jesus and angels could do the same, it's the same problem. But it's not. Because when Christians are talking about Jesus and miracles, we're not talking about isolated, meaningless, random events. We're actually talking about events, miracles that form a pattern focusing on Jesus, pointing to him, which are given with words which also explain about him. In other words, this is the way it's put in the beginning of John's Gospel. Really, that Jesus is presented as the organizing principle of reality. It goes like this. In the beginning was the Word, so Word, what you communicate with, and the Word was with God, great, and the Word was God. And then it'll explain how the Word became flesh. People often say, well, if God's there, why doesn't he speak? The answer is he has spoken. He spoke in the best way you possibly can, embodied, sending a person, sending his son to communicate to us, to speak to us. So in other words, if you want to know who God is, Don't look at Christians. Don't look at, religious types. Look at Jesus. And the way you find out about Jesus is in the Gospels. And the beautiful message is this, that when you look at humans, we have this problem. We have this problem. We like to deny it. We like to cover it up. And, I'm going to use the word sin. It's just basically doing wrong stuff. And we see it in politicians very easily. We just don't, the way newspapers work, don't you? Newspapers tell us which group of people we should be angry against, okay? They never tell their readers that you need to be angry with yourselves or anything like that. So it's always, you can blame this group, that group, and the different political spectrum is all about blaming a different group rather than accepting that we are actually responsible for messing up the world. And the great thing is, we can't put it right, but God has come in the person of his son to, on the cross, die, taking the worst possible punishment, which is the punishment that we deserve, and taking it in our place so that if we trust in him, we can actually know him and have a living relationship with him and actually sense that taking away of any sense of guilt you have, because really the guilt has been objectively dealt with. Now that's a lot to say, a lot to take in, and I'm sure some of the resources at the back about the word one-to-one will say something about that, and someone will talk about that soon. But anyway, you've listened for a very long time, and I've gone on for a long time. There will be questions in a while after a break, but back over to Barbara.